It's the safest, most flown, and most produced aircraft in the history of aviation. The Cessna 172 isn't just a plane. It's a global rite of passage for pilots. From flight schools in Florida to remote strips in Africa, nearly every pilot alive has either flown it, trained in it, or dreamed of it. Most of us admire the high wings, the forgiving flight controls, and that unmistakable silhouette. But one thing deserves the spotlight as much as the aircraft itself, because under that cowling is the real reason this aircraft earned its reputation. A machine that's quietly powered millions of takeoffs, landings, and life lessons. Today, we're pulling back the engine cover, quite literally, to see how 172 gets airborne. What makes the 172 tick? Why is it trusted worldwide? And what every pilot should know before turning the key. You might be surprised by what's hiding in plain sight. If you're passionate about aviation, aircraft engineering, or just love knowing what keeps legends like the 172 flying, make sure to subscribe. We marvel at the machines flying in the skies, and there's a lot more coming you won't want to miss. Now, before we dig into the engine, let's take a moment to understand what kind of aircraft we're talking about. Because the Cessna 172 isn't just popular, it's historically unmatched. First flown in 1955, and still rolling off production lines today, over 45,000 Cessna 172's have been built. That makes it the most produced aircraft in the world, with no close second. It's also considered one of the safest general aviation aircraft ever made, with accident rates significantly lower than many of its peers. And there's a reason for that. It's stable, predictable, forgiving, and easy to fly, especially in the hands of students, bush pilots in Alaska, flight cadets in India. This aircraft has shown up in every corner of the world. It's flown over mountains, deserts, oceans, and into aviation history. But here's the thing. All of that praise? It starts with what's under the cowling, because none of those stats, records, or first solos would exist without one core component, the engine. And that's where we're going next. When the first Cessna 172 rolled out in 1955, it became an overnight success. 1,400 units were built in just the first year of production, and for that time, it was pretty huge for any aircraft. And the reason for that kind of success was Continental O300 engine, a 145 horsepower, 6-cylinder design that gave the aircraft smooth performance and a reliable start to its legacy. But as flight schools demanded more power and simpler maintenance, Cessna made a switch that would define the 172's modern era, the Lycoming O320. This 4-cylinder, 150 to 160 horsepower engine changed the game entirely. This one was lighter, simpler, and more adaptable, and it quickly became the workhorse of the 172 fleet. Later variants, like the Cessna 172’s, moved to the Lycoming O360, a fuel-injected, 180-horsepower engine that added better climb performance and efficiency. If the aircraft was to climb a higher altitude, O360 outperformed every single time. This version became the go-to engine for modern flight training and remains in production today. Through all these upgrades, one thing stayed the same. The 172 has never needed a turbocharger, a complex gearbox, or digital engine control to prove itself. Just honest, direct power. The kind that pilots can feel and mechanics can trust. But what makes the Lycoming family so enduring? Why are these engines still preferred over newer, more advanced tech in training aircraft? To understand that, we need to look deeper into the core design, strengths, and quirks of the engine itself. At the heart of most Cessna 172's is one of two engines, the Lycoming O320 or the 0360. These engines might not look like much, a compact gray block bolted to the nose, but they're surprisingly good at how they work. The 0320 makes about 150 horsepower. Later versions, like the 0360, give you 180 horsepower. A little extra muscle for better climb and speed. But here's the key. Both engines are air-cooled, run on regular aviation fuel, and are designed to be as simple and durable as possible. They breathe the same air we do, and do just fine with it. Inside, the engine has 4 pistons that move back and forth, kind of like a boxer throwing punches left and right. That's why it's called horizontally opposed. This layout keeps the engine balanced and smooth, which is important when you're flying through the sky. Older 1720s use something called a carburetor, which mixes air and fuel kind of like a blender. Newer models use fuel injection, which is more precise and efficient, especially at higher altitudes. Either way, the engine breathes in air, adds fuel, ignites it, and pushes the plane forward. Even the ignition system is designed for safety. It doesn't rely on the battery. Instead, it uses something called magnetos, which generate their own spark. So even if the electronics fail, the engine keeps running. It's not high-tech. It doesn't need to be. That's the beauty of it. But how does this engine breathe, burn, and keep from overheating? All without the fancy tech we're used to in cars. Let's talk about how it stays alive. Now you're already aware how engines and heat are a no-no. And when you're flying at full power, thousands of feet above the ground, without a radiator, keeping cool becomes a serious challenge. The Cessna 172 engine solves this with something surprisingly simple: airflow. When the propeller spins, it pulls in air, and that air rushes over the engine's metal fins. These fins act like little heat sinks. That means drawing warmth away from the engine block and letting the wind carry it off. It's kind of like standing in front of a fan after a workout. Basic, but effective. But cooling isn't just about air. It's also about how much fuel and air get mixed in the engine. Too much fuel and things run cooler, but inefficiently. Too little, and the engine can overheat or knock. That's why pilots learn to manage the mixture control, adding or reducing fuel based on altitude, air temperature, and even engine sound. And here's where it gets interesting. Most people think the engine just burns fuel like a car, but in flight, it's not that straightforward. The air gets thinner the higher you go. That changes how the engine breathes and how it performs. We'll get into why flying too high without adjusting this mix can actually damage the engine, and why that tiny red knob in the cockpit matters more than most people think. Then there's fuel delivery. In older 1720s, the carburetor handles it. A simple mechanical system that mixes air and fuel before it enters the cylinders. But carburetors have a quirk. They can cause carb ice, even on warm days. It's rare, but when it happens, power drops fast. Newer 1720s, like the S model, avoid this with fuel injection. This particular system sprays fuel directly into each cylinder. It's more efficient and less prone to icing, but also a bit more expensive to maintain. So, which one is better? Well, it depends on who you ask and how you fly. But regardless of the system, both types rely on one constant: clean, consistent air. So what happens when that airflow is disrupted or blocked altogether? Believe it or not, it's happened before, and the result isn't pretty. The Lycoming engines used in the Cessna 172 have earned a reputation for reliability, and rightly so. But no machine is invincible, and in aviation, even a small oversight can turn deadly. Let's start with engine overtemping. Every engine has a red line. a temperature it should never cross, push the throttle too hard on a hot day, climb too steep without enough airflow, or forget to adjust the fuel-air mixture. And the engine will overheat. The result? Power loss, metal fatigue, or in worst cases, a full engine failure. Then there's the issue of oil pressure. Pilots are trained to keep one eye on the oil gauge. Why? Because oil is like blood in the engine. If pressure drops suddenly, it could mean a leak, a blockage, or the oil pump failing. Without oil, metal parts grind against each other and the engine seizes. Fast. But here's the thing. Most 172 engine issues don't come from design flaws. They come from pilot error or poor maintenance, forgetting to check fuel quality, skipping an oil change, or failing to warm up the engine properly in cold weather. These are the real culprits behind most in-flight problems. Which brings us to an important question. What happens when an engine does fail in flight? Can a Cessna 172 glide to safety? There's also a less talked about, but equally important issue: shock cooling. This happens when the engine goes from hot to cold too quickly. Why? Because the plane's descending rapidly from high altitude without reducing power gradually. It's like pouring ice water on a hot pan. The metal can crack. Pilots learn to descend gently and reduce power slowly. But not everyone follows best practices. And the damage isn't always immediate. Cracks can form deep inside the cylinder head and go unnoticed until the next flight. So how do Lycoming engines stay in the air after thousands of hours of flight time? How are they inspected, overhauled, and trusted all over the world? That's where we go next. You might think a small aircraft engine wouldn't last long, especially when it's flying in all kinds of weather, from freezing mornings to blazing hot afternoons. But the Lycoming engines used in the Cessna 172 are built differently. They're built to last. On average, these engines are rated for what's called a TBO, which stands for time between overhaul. And for Cessna 172, that score is around 2,000 hours. That means if you flew for 2 hours every day, it would take almost 3 years before the engine was even due for a deep inspection. And many of them run smoothly far beyond that, if maintained properly. But what does properly mean? It starts with regular oil changes, checking the spark plugs, and inspecting for small cracks before they become big problems. Aviation maintenance might seem obsessive, but when you're thousands of feet in the air, every bolt matters. There's also something called a top overhaul. This is where mechanics just focus on the cylinders, valves, and heads, instead of taking the entire engine apart. It's like giving your engine a tune-up halfway through its life to keep it running strong. Some pilots even schedule these voluntarily, just for peace of mind. But here's where it gets interesting. Many 172's outlast their first engine entirely. In fact, some of these aircraft have flown with 3 or 4 different engines over their lifetimes. That means the airframe stays the same, while the engine gets swapped, restored, or upgraded. So how do mechanics know when an engine's finally worn out for good? What signs do they look for inside the cylinders, or hidden in the oil? The answers tell an unbelievable story about how pilots and machines work together. Now here's a question that often gets asked by new pilots. Should you buy a used plane with a high-hour engine, or one that's already been overhauled? The truth is, it's not always what you'd expect. And while we're on it, if the engine is so reliable, why do some owners still end up with sudden failures? What's being missed in the maintenance process? And how can it be avoided? So, should you buy a used Cessna 172 with a high-hour engine, or one that's already been overhauled? It depends. But here's what experienced pilots and mechanics will tell you. A high-hour engine that's been flown regularly and maintained meticulously can be a safer bet than one that's been overhauled but sat idle for years. Why? Because engines are like muscles. They perform better when exercised. When they sit too long, corrosion starts to creep in, seals dry up, and problems can hide under the surface. Overhauls are great, but only if they're done by reputable shops and paired with proper break-in procedures afterward. Now about those unexpected failures. Why do they still happen, even with such a reliable engine? Here's the brutal truth. It's not usually the engine's fault. The vast majority of in-flight failures in Cessna 172's come down to human error. Skipped inspections, poor pre-flight checks, running the engine too lean for too long at high power, or not recognizing subtle warning signs like a drop in oil pressure, odd engine noise, or a sluggish start. Sometimes it's even smaller than that. A piece of debris blocking an air intake, water-contaminated fuel, a loose spark plug wire. These issues can be caught. If the pilot knows what to look for and takes their time during inspections, he usually gets to the root cause of trouble. And as for gliding after an engine failure, the Cessna 172 is surprisingly good at it. With its high wing design and stable glide ratio, pilots have safely landed without power many times. In fact, some instructors even simulate engine outs in training because it's one of the best aircraft to learn emergency procedures in. But there's a deeper lesson here. The Lycoming engine and the Cessna 172 teaches pilots a kind of mechanical mindfulness. It rewards good habits, attention to detail, and respect for simplicity. It doesn't hide behind digital layers or automation. It shows you everything and it expects you to pay attention. Because in the end, this engine isn't just a power plant. It's a partner. One that's helped tens of thousands of pilots learn not just how to fly, but how to think like pilots. So what do you think about this amazing aircraft? Share your experiences in the comments below.